It began with confusion. In the xenopsychology archives of the Dominion, humanity's combat behavior was flagged for inconsistency, erratic, statistically anomalous, dangerously illogical. Field analysts reviewing tactical footage from border skirmishes and proxy wars filed reports not of bravery, but of dysfunction. The question repeated across sectors wasn't how humans fought, but why they did so in direct defiance of all logic. Alien commanders described them as unstable assets. Dominion war theorists called them strategic liabilities with a high probability of victory. It didn't make sense. Not to any species that had achieved spaceflight through the application of reason. In the Quran training simulations, each species' combat record had been distilled into behavior matrices. The Varn, for instance, displayed optimum withdrawal efficiency at 17% threat overmatch. The Cerati maintained unit cohesion across loss rates up to 23%. Humans? Their cohesion increased past the 50% casualty mark. Coordinated offensives with decapitated command chains. Counterattacks in the face of guaranteed death. One case cited a human corporal who, with both legs shredded by shrapnel, had crawled forward dragging grenades in his belt with his teeth. Not an outlier. There were thousands of these instances. When the Dominion's cognition engines tried to model human reflexes, the simulations failed. Parameters collapsed. Combat stress responses did not align with any known species. Where others chose self-preservation, humans triggered a surge of neural activity tied to aggression, tactile memory, and emotional recall. Not fight or flight. Fight and fight harder. They would charge while wounded. They would scream when they should go silent. They would laugh during firefights, as if the moment held some absurd joy. One archived battlefield report recounted a human soldier, surrounded, pinned behind a plasma-scorched barrier, initiating a direct advance while shouting personal names. Not code. Names. Later decoded as fallen squadmates. It wasn't a strategy. It was something else: ritual, memory, defiance. Or maybe grief weaponized into motion. Dominion combat philosophy had long held that the highest form of tactical wisdom was avoidance. Risk minimization. Human doctrine viewed hesitation as betrayal. Delay as death. Alien tacticians prioritized precision. Humans prioritized impact. Where other soldiers sought survival, humans sought meaning. This was the true deviation. Not strength. Not speed. But purpose, injected into every reflex. There was no detachment in their warfare. Every move was personal. Every trigger pulled with intent beyond outcome. Alien observers found this terrifying. To fight without emotional distance was suicidal in theory. But humans didn't die by theory. They survived by refusal. Their bodies were unspecialized, average strength, poor armor, fragile joints. Their advantage lay not in biology, but in defiance of it. Hormonal cascades turned pain into fuel. Social bonds made protection of the group override self-preservation. Their brains adapted under duress, not after. Tactile memory rewired under live fire. And all of it reinforced by culture that idolized the unthinkable. Last stand? Against all odds. Over my dead body. To alien species, these were metaphors. To humans, they were instructions. The Varn linguists flagged hundreds of human idioms for analysis. Bite the bullet. Throw yourself into it. Light a fire under them. Each one a glimpse into a species that trained for pain, not in spite of it, but because of it. It wasn't madness. It was design, refined through millennia of conflict, encoded into myth, glorified in song and cinema. Even their stories praised those who acted despite fear, because of fear. This generated a problem for Dominion simulations. Enemy behavior is predictable when pain is a deterrent. But humans don't avoid pain. They anticipate it. They plan for it. And they transform it. One Cerati commander, post-defeat, called it emotional jujitsu. Every weapon turned against them became an excuse to escalate. Plasma burns triggered adrenaline. Psychological warfare only enraged them. The more you cornered a human, the more variables you introduced, the more dangerous they became. Attempts to replicate human aggression failed in other species. Aggression divorced from empathy resulted in chaos. Empathy without aggression produced paralysis. But humans, somehow, combined both. They killed with tears in their eyes and a hand reaching back for the wounded. There were no protocols for this. No warnings in the training manuals. No simulations that accounted for a being that would crawl, bleeding, not toward escape, but toward the gunfire, because someone else hadn't made it out. Because a name still echoed in their skull. Because something in them refused to break until everything else did. And that was the unsettling truth. Human combat reflexes weren't broken. They were just beyond understanding. The evolution of human combat behavior wasn't a fluke. It was the result of relentless environmental hostility and continuous exposure to threat over tens of thousands of years. Long before they reached the stars, humans were forged in a crucible of chaos unmatched by most sentient life. Their ancestors didn't just survive danger, they adapted to it, internalized it, and eventually thrived in it. The planet they evolved on, Earth, was not gentle. Massive predators, volatile climate shifts, disease, food scarcity, and intertribal violence were constants. There was no period of safety long enough for passivity to take root. Survival required aggression, but not just brute force. Success favored the ones who could think during pain, who could plan while wounded, who learned to associate danger not with paralysis but with action. From this, the foundation of their reflexive responses took shape. Not conditioned by comfort, but honed by unpredictability. Where most species evolved along lines of sensory specialization or environmental niche exploitation, humans evolved through pressure and improvisation. Their upright stance freed their hands. Fire extended their reach. Tools magnified their will. But the real transformation was cognitive. They began to understand threat not only as something to flee, but as something to face, study, and ultimately confront. Pain became a teacher. Loss, a motivator. This rewiring didn't stop at survival, it continued into culture. Early human tribes glorified courage. Ritualized endurance. They ran toward predators in hunting packs, not away. They painted their bodies not for camouflage, but for intimidation. They sang war chants that triggered emotional synchronization. Over time, these behaviors codified into belief systems. Deities of war. Tales of sacrifice. Legends where dying in battle was not failure but honor. This ideology saturated their neural framework. And with each generation, the boundary between fear and aggression thinned. Their neurochemistry adapted in kind. When faced with immediate threat, humans released a cocktail of substances: adrenaline for speed, cortisol for focus, endorphins for pain management, and dopamine for reward. This blend didn't just prepare the body, it rewarded the mind during conflict. Where most species broke down under prolonged stress, humans learned to operate in it, and in rare cases, even crave it. Combat, for many, became not just a duty, but a domain of clarity. Their psychological advantage lay in their emotional complexity. Other species viewed emotion as interference in combat. For humans, it was fuel. Rage could override hesitation. Grief could sharpen resolve. Love could anchor the will to endure. The concept of fighting for someone else wasn't abstract, it was real, and it changed outcomes. Soldiers would cross minefields not for orders, but for brothers, sisters, friends. Bonds were not strategic, they were sacred. This emotional amplification wasn't accidental. It was cultivated. From a young age, humans told stories of heroes who overcame impossible odds, who stood when others ran, who chose sacrifice when logic dictated surrender. These weren't anomalies, they were templates. Children grew up mimicking these ideals. Adolescents tested their limits. Adults carried those mental scripts into real conflict. The result was a population whose response to fear was rarely withdrawal, it was transformation. Even in training, their methods reinforced this wiring. Drills were designed to simulate chaos, not avoid it. Soldiers were conditioned not to eliminate fear, but to navigate it. They weren't told pain was failure, they were taught pain was information. Every scenario pushed them further from comfort, into realms where instinct took over. But these instincts weren't animal, they were narrative. You are the one who stands. You are the last line. You don't stop until it's done. This frame of mind wasn't confined to elites. Even civilians, in moments of crisis, often displayed similar traits. Human history is filled with examples of untrained individuals acting with precision, courage, and resolve under fire. Not because they were ordered. Because they believed they had to. This belief system, interwoven with biology, created a species that didn't just survive violence, it repurposed it. No other known civilization embedded combat identity so deeply across its entire social spectrum. On other worlds, soldiers were tools. In humanity, warriors were ideals. In every nation, every language, across thousands of years, the figure of the defender, the fighter, the relentless guardian recurred. Sometimes in armor. Sometimes in mud. But always standing. By the time they entered the galactic stage, humans weren't confused about violence. They had long accepted it as a reality of existence. What puzzled the stars was how humans had managed to make violence mean something. It wasn't just power, it was principle. And behind every reflex, every decision to move forward instead of away, was the shadow of a story they had already seen themselves play. The Battle of Karuk V was supposed to be a simulation writ large, a demonstration of tactical supremacy for Dominion-aligned coalition forces. Every variable had been modeled, every unit tracked. Projections estimated a clean operation lasting under 4 hours. Human involvement was nominal, only a single reconnaissance unit embedded with Dominion auxiliaries. Their role was observation. Contingency. Nothing more. The enemy struck earlier than predicted. A rogue faction of cyber-adaptive mercenaries deployed jamming fields and began a full-scale orbital assault, disabling Dominion comms within minutes. Entire battalions lost connection to command. Unit cohesion began to erode. Preset retreat protocols triggered for multiple species, some withdrawing without engaging. The battlefront fractured before it had fully formed. The human unit, Echo Red, received no orders. Their systems scrambled. GPS down. AI guidance loops. They had no confirmation of allies, no map, no fallback. Under protocol, they should have held position. Instead, they advanced. Not toward safety, but toward the last known coordinates of a stranded Dominion squad under fire. Without support. Without a plan. Just direction and intent. Initial surveillance drones recorded the movement. Analysts flagged the maneuver as irrational. Echo Red wasn't equipped for offensive support. Light armor. Minimal heavy weapons. Against mechanized enemy forces, the odds were terminal. The humans moved anyway, fast, low, silent. Not erratic, not panicked. Intentional. Their line cut a direct path through enemy lines. Shots fired. Not suppressive, targeted. Each movement optimized for disruption, not cover. In 23 minutes, they reached the Dominion unit, losing 2 members in the process. But they didn't extract. They reinforced. What followed defied Dominion understanding of asymmetric engagement. The humans reorganized the battered squad, redistributed ammunition, synchronized movement, without digital coordination. They used hand signals, body cues, audible clicks. When the next wave came, they didn't hold the line. They ambushed. Close quarters combat. No fallback. A soldier named Ridley breached an enemy heavy exosuit by physically climbing it, tearing out its power core. He died seconds later. But the breach allowed others to advance. Enemy response units adapted. They deployed flame weapons and concussive pulses. Human injuries mounted. Casualty rates exceeded 60%. Dominion forces watching from orbit assumed the remaining Echo Red members would disengage. Instead, they split. Half drew enemy fire uphill. The others circled through a burning ravine to flank the artillery line. Dominion sensors recorded one operative, last name Chen, charging with no functioning weapon, using only a plasma shield and 2 detonation charges. That single push collapsed the mercenary artillery support. The flanking team neutralized 4 enemy units and forced a full repositioning of the mercenary second wave. Dominion reinforcements arrived 90 minutes later, expecting to find a slaughter. They found a cratered hillside and a human-led mixed unit still holding ground. No clear formation. Just bodies in motion, weapons scavenged from enemies, makeshift fortifications built from wreckage. Echo Red had started with 11 members. 4 remained. 3 conscious. The others were being stabilized by improvised medical rigs powered by stripped battery cores. The Dominion squad they'd saved had lost no one after Echo Red's arrival. Not a single casualty after reinforcement. Analysts couldn't reconcile it. Their simulations didn't account for commandless initiative under total communications blackout. Their doctrines didn't cover sacrificing strategic position for moral obligation. Later review of Echo Red's helmet cams showed something even more confounding. In moments of critical decision, under fire, bleeding, overwhelmed, there was no hesitation. One soldier shouted the name of his sibling before throwing himself into an oncoming drone column. Another covered a downed alien comrade not because of protocol, but because she looked scared. None of these decisions made tactical sense. All of them shifted momentum. Post-battle review declared the outcome statistically impossible. Enemy forces had withdrawn, demoralized. Their neural relays had detected signals from human operatives that didn't align with known threat patterns: erratic vocalizations, rapid position shifts, refusal to retreat. Dominion officers classified the engagement a conditional success. Human analysts called it something else: necessary. Echo Red was not decorated by Dominion command. Their methods were too unpredictable, too unreplicable. But in closed-door sessions, Dominion tacticians began to revise their assumptions. They reviewed the footage not for errors, but for clues. Something within that unit had operated beyond known metrics. Beyond discipline. Beyond survival. They hadn't just held the line. They'd rewritten it. The inquiry into human behavior following Karuk V shifted tone. What was once categorized as aberrant was now reclassified as adaptive. The Dominion's Department of Combat Analytics initiated a cross-species audit to determine whether human combat traits could be genetically replicated or culturally transplanted. The findings were conclusive: replication failed. Every attempt to mimic human responses produced instability, inconsistency, or total system failure. Something about human behavior couldn't be reverse-engineered. Biological scans revealed nothing remarkable. Muscle density, skeletal structure, reflex speed, all within galactic norms. What stood out was the human brain's plasticity under trauma. Neural rerouting occurred during stress, not afterward. Brain activity didn't collapse under threat, it surged. Cortical mapping showed that decision-making pathways widened during life-threatening situations, increasing not just reaction but resolution. This wasn't luck. It was optimization born from chaos. Their cultural psychology made the phenomenon more pronounced. Pain wasn't just tolerated, it was woven into meaning. Where other species insulated trauma, humans assigned it value. They didn't compartmentalize loss. They carried it. Not as burden but as fuel. Names of the dead became rallying cries. Scars became stories. They didn't suppress fear, they walked beside it. Emotion didn't interfere with action, it sharpened it. Dominion officials interviewed captured human soldiers after Karuk V. One question was repeated: why didn't you fall back? The answers weren't tactical. Because they needed me. Because I couldn't let them die alone. Because no one else was going to do it. These weren't orders. They were convictions. And they were consistent across ranks, ages, backgrounds. When threatened, humans didn't default to preservation. They defaulted to responsibility. Attempts to manufacture this mindset failed catastrophically. Dominion-trained soldiers exposed to simulated loss scenarios broke under sustained exposure. The only species capable of maintaining cohesion under grief were humans. Not because they felt less, but because they embraced the pain without crumbling. One alien psychologist noted that humans were the only species observed to process mourning while actively engaging in combat. This intersection of biology and belief created something no algorithm could replicate: intentional irrationality. Humans made decisions that seemed senseless by traditional logic, but proved effective in results. Charging a fortified position, shielding a wounded ally, staying behind so others could escape. These actions didn't just occur, they recurred. They were patterned, but not programmable. That was the paradox. The system only worked if the participant chose it. Willingly. Freely. No coercion. No conditioning. It had to come from within. The realization reframed centuries of assumptions. Perhaps humanity wasn't flawed. Perhaps their reflexes weren't broken. They had simply evolved along a path that no other species dared take. They didn't prioritize efficiency. They prioritized meaning. Every engagement, every sacrifice, every loss, part of a narrative larger than any single life. This narrative orientation gave them an edge that data couldn't quantify. They believed their choices mattered, even in the face of annihilation. In one recorded case, a human pilot landed a crippled shuttle with no thrusters, using only atmospheric drag and manual compensation. When asked how he managed it, he responded, "I told the ship we weren't dying today." No mechanical link existed between verbal command and control system. The act was symbolic. The ship didn't respond. But the man did. Because the statement wasn't to the machine. It was to himself. Human combat leadership often avoided centralized control. Decentralization wasn't disorder, it was trust. Each unit was trained not just to obey, but to decide. Independence wasn't failure to conform. It was a core doctrine. Trust the squad. Trust the instinct. Move forward. Adjust later. That dynamic responsiveness overwhelmed static opponents who waited for orders. While others paused, humans had already acted. The Dominion eventually ceased its replication programs. Not out of failure, but out of respect. What made humans effective was not extractable. It was internal. Contextual. Their strength wasn't in their tech or genes, it was in how they chose to suffer and what they did with that suffering. They didn't just endure adversity. They gave it direction. Human reflexes weren't broken. They were the product of a species that had decided, long ago, that survival wasn't enough. That survival without meaning was surrender. And meaning, for them, often emerged clearest when everything else had collapsed. What began as confusion ended in recalibration. They weren't unpredictable. They were unwavering. Within 3 cycles of Karuk V, military doctrines across the outer systems began to shift. Quietly at first. Not through public decree, but in training centers and black ops regiments. Analysts who once dismissed human tactics as emotional volatility began dissecting them as complex systems of adaptive resilience. Tactical academies replaced sections of their strategy curriculum with case studies titled Terran Response Models. The language was clinical, but the intent was clear. The galaxy was beginning to learn from them. The first to adapt were mercenary groups with no centralized command hierarchy. They mimicked human decentralization and found their response times improved under pressure. Then came elite strike units on fringe colonies. They introduced emotional anchoring protocols, personal totems, recorded messages from loved ones, symbolic reinforcement to simulate what humans seemed to carry innately. It didn't replicate the results, but it reduced combat paralysis by measurable margins. Formal militaries took longer. The Dominion resisted longest. But the footage from Echo Red never disappeared. The metrics kept contradicting expectations. Human integrated teams consistently outperformed control groups when communications failed or plans collapsed. What began as anomaly was redefined as advantage. Eventually, Dominion Command authorized integrated human liaison units within its elite divisions, not for diversity, but for survival. What followed wasn't just tactical evolution, it was cultural infection. Soldiers began adopting human phrases. Not out of policy, but necessity. Terminology like, dig deep, one more push, hold the line, filtered through units never trained in Terran history. Their meanings weren't literal. They were emotional triggers, shortcuts to resolve under chaos. The language of persistence embedded itself without translation. Instructors observed an unanticipated effect. Units exposed to human doctrine didn't just fight harder. They bonded deeper. Retention rates improved. Recovery from psychological trauma accelerated. Soldiers returned from battle quoting Terran war poetry, replicating rituals of fallen commemoration, carrying objects tied to memory. None of this was issued. It spread laterally. Not orders. Influence. Former enemies took notice. Combatants who once considered humanity undisciplined began interrogating prisoners not for intelligence, but for insight. They wanted to understand what made a soldier run into fire for someone else. They began to fear not human strength, but what that strength inspired. For the first time, morale became a destabilizing force, not because of weapons, but because of what humans made people believe they could do. Terran advisors coined a phrase for this transition: the Terran threshold. It marked the point where logic yielded to will, where protocol no longer guided response, where belief determined survival. Crossing that threshold didn't mean becoming human. It meant accepting that victory wasn't always measurable in assets or positions. Sometimes it was determined by who refused to fall. By the next galactic cycle, entire divisions were trained using Terran aggression models. But without the restraint of Terran morality, results varied. Some species adopted human tactics but lacked the stabilizing element, purpose. Aggression became chaos. Loss became collapse. The key variable remained unchanged: belief had to precede action. Without it, imitation produced failure. The Dominion eventually commissioned a long-form analysis titled The Human Variable, Intent as Doctrine. The conclusion was not a template. It was a warning. What humans had developed was not a strategy. It was an identity. An identity could not be programmed. It had to be chosen. In the outer reaches, a new threat emerged: autonomous war machines with no culture, no memory, only replication. They swept through colonies, overwhelming traditional defenses. Tactical models failed. Protocols broke. In desperation, multi-species coalitions assembled, most having trained under the new paradigm. Human commanders were placed not because of rank, but because their approach offered the only model that made sense when nothing else did. On the front lines, beings who had never met a human adopted their rituals. Names were spoken before charges. Wounded were carried when logic said leave them. Enemy units noted irregular patterns, fighters rallying after command collapse, pushing forward without reinforcements, acting on something unseen. They weren't following orders. They were following conviction. When the machines faltered, it wasn't due to firepower. It was because they couldn't predict what had no precedent. The coalition didn't win by numbers. It endured by refusal. And at the center of it all stood the doctrine no one could write down, no algorithm could replicate, no command could issue: the human instinct to fight not just for survival, but for each other. Humanity had not broken combat. They had redefined its purpose.